Hello, I'm George Mason, host of Good God, conversations that matter about faith and public life. We'll be talking today with my guest, Amy Lewis Hofland, who is the executive director of the Crow Collection of Asian Art here in Dallas. And we'll be talking specifically about the connection between faith and how a fearless heart is really the key to growing in your spiritual life. Welcome to Good God, conversations that matter about faith and public life. I'm George Mason, your host, and I'm pleased to welcome today Amy Lewis Hofland, who is the executive director of the Crow Collection of Asian Art here in Dallas. And Amy, it's so good to have you and to talk with you about, about art, but maybe in this episode, maybe also about faith and about how we call this episode Good God, but this may be more about the interaction between our life of faith here in Dallas and your experience and mine, and how cultures actually enrich that and we learn from it. So let's begin by asking you about your own faith experience and your own faith journey. Where has it been and where has it taken you?
Well, I'm a cradle Episcopalian.
Okay.
And there were many cradles before that.
Yes.
And I come from a family that has always, they're church builders.
Okay.
So my grandparents started St. Paul's on the Plains in Lubbock, Texas.
Wow.
An Episcopal church that's still there today. And I just grew up in a home where faith was our most important time together. It was our quiet space. It was a place of understanding for our family. And we are proud Episcopalians. My dad has been the senior warden at his church for, 15 years, and we're so proud of his leadership. And so it was always expected that church was a place where we practiced our faith tradition, but we also helped it grow for others. So I learned a lot as an Episcopalian. Senior
warden has always been a title that makes me feel like a church is a prison or something, and you need somebody to look after.
I know, isn't that true? Isn't that true?
But the Episcopalians have all the great titles, right? For their ministers and clergy, the vicars and the rectors
and the canons to the ordinary.
Exactly, I know. Oh my goodness. But nonetheless, so the Episcopal tradition of the Christian faith is a sacramental tradition, you might say. There's a Protestant aspect to it, but the Episcopal tradition is still comes out of the Catholic side of Christianity, which has a high emphasis on the table, whereas maybe Protestantism is more about word and preaching and doctrine and those sorts of things.
Right.
Episcopalians have been more around the gathering at the table, around what we have in common, and that actually has a bit more of a connection to nature and to community and food and all of that. These kinds of emphases actually we find in Eastern religions too, which is maybe an unexpected link for you in terms of your journey.
Unexpected even as of 2 weeks ago.
Really?
So I'm still finding and still learning about the impact of these connections.
Okay.
Just 2 weeks ago, I attended the Maundy Thursday service and the Good Friday service and Holy Saturday.
Yes.
And humbly, I admit I'd never been to those services. I think I've probably been to the Vigil Friday before. But
this makes my heart so warmed that you attended these services. Because,
good. I had no idea.
Right.
I had no idea, and I'm so grateful. I'm on a committee that has invited us to study these journey to the cross.
Yes.
And I was blown away by the integrity that I learned in those services. The integrity of how Jesus talked to the disciples and how fearless he was going into that journey and prepared and steeped in love. I mean, all the things that I like to think about on the positive side of the church calendar, right? Easter and Christmas. And humbly, I'd never dealt with that side of it. And I think what has happened for me is my exploration of Buddhism and Hinduism and those theologies, and especially Buddhism,
Yes.
around truth and sort of looking for right speech and deep listening. Opened up my heart that week in a way that I've never experienced. So
Wonderful.
it's very fresh that you've asked me this question, because I can say fully that I'm more Episcopalian than ever after leading an Asian art museum for 20 years. So
it's interesting. Buddhism was born out of this wrestling with suffering and the problem of evil
Right.
and that sort of thing. And for many Christians in the West who move from Palm Sunday to Easter Sunday, and they skip right over Holy Week,
Right.
the suffering and the darkness and the pain and the sacrifice and the
Right.
commitment of love, to keep going and to
It's
go
all
through
there.
It's all there, and yet in our tradition we seem to want the victory without the struggle,
Right.
and so being able to recognize that you don't get to abundant life by hopscotching over the difficulties and the challenges.
Right.
You go through it, not around it or over it, right?
And I'm so aware of it. We
Yes.
love comfort.
Yes.
I have a car. I have a car, and the steering wheel has a heater.
Yes.
Our seats have air conditioners.
Right.
And it makes me so uncomfortable when I drive past a homeless person on the sidewalk. And I've got to figure out what is the best right action for me in that situation.
Good.
And how to create conversations that help a city manage homelessness and racism and all of these things. And, today it's so present for me because I know Highland Park High School has recently had some issues with the students in where the junior boys were pushing Chinese girls out of the lunchroom because they were speaking Chinese. We're not disconnected from this. We like to be,
Yes.
like we like to be disconnected from the crucifixion, but we can't lie to ourselves anymore.
Good.
And we have to be courageous and have the conversation and be fearless about teaching religion.
Yes.
I loved it. Mayor Rawlings was at our Festival of Joy on Saturday at Clyde Warren Park. And the Festival of Joy celebrates Krishna, and the deities are brought from the temple in East Dallas. And it was the first time in 35 years that they've left the East Dallas neighborhood around Gurley and brought the deities to the Arts District. And Mayor Rawlings put on a turban.
Wow.
Isn't that great?
It is amazing.
And of course, he's been a great mayor for our city for so many reasons, not just the arts, but to be ready to have a conversation around how we love each other.
Well, this, I think, is a really important thing happening in Dallas, and I'm not sure that everyone appreciates just quite the significance of what you're describing here. But if you think about how Dallas is changing, and in my mind, and yours, I think, positively, we are moving from a more homogeneous culture and a spirit that wants to keep reinforcing these sort of protected neighborhoods and segregated schools. And now, of course, they're legally desegregated, but we've been historically de facto still segregated by choice. But education and the arts and our neighborhoods, we're becoming more aware of how the poverty in certain areas of Dallas is not all by accident, and it's not all by choice. It's by intention, where we build highways, what we specifically do with civic services, city services. And so we're starting to see the profile of people come up more around this diversity and unity, and let's be a city for everyone. And that's also a religious matter, isn't it?
It is. It's a religious matter, and it's a human survival matter.
Yes.
And I love the work of Karen Armstrong, and that led me to the book, The 12 Steps to a More Compassionate Life.
I know that book, yes.
We've done that book study in several organizations downtown, and I'm now on the board of Compassionate DFW.
Good.
And Compassionate DFW is walking the walk and trying to figure out through the 8 sectors that are part of the organization, how do we handle this deep history of race in Dallas?
Absolutely.
And we can apologize for it, and we have, and we will continue to apologize for what has happened in the city, but we really have to act on making it right.
I think that when we talk about apologies, it makes people nervous who have been part of who are beneficiaries of that history, right? So people who look like you and me, Amy, right? We have been beneficiaries of privilege and of segregation and of the kinds of human capital and social capital that has allowed us to flourish, that also has a shadow side.
Right.
And so it makes a lot of folks nervous because we'd like to say, well, that wasn't us, that was our forebears.
Right.
But then when people who have suffered at the hands of this say, wait a minute, we want to talk about that. We'd like to say, no, that was then, this is now.
Yeah.
And it occurs to me that our faith traditions say that repentance actually has to be judged by what fruits of change, how you're actually going to say, if you want to say you're sorry about something, show me that you've changed the way you're behaving
exactly
now. And I think we'd like to be able to say we're sorry and then continue to go on our way.
Yeah, and it's not a monument.
It's not a monument.
It's not a monument.
Exactly.
It's 100% responsibility.
Yes.
We talk about this term a lot at our museum, where if you ask someone to do something, you don't just pass it off. Like compassionate DFW cannot create Dallas as a compassionate city.
Yes.
We have to be responsible for the events we create and the actions we create and the intentions that we set all the way through to the end.
Yes.
And the end is when we truly can say Dallas is a compassionate city.
Right.
So it's really, you're right, it's so much more than grace making or apologizing. It's about what are we going to do that shows up for that human that's suffered.
Right. So the biblical traditions teach us that we can't live in word only, but we must live in deed. Right. So getting words and deeds together. Actually, the Hebrew word davar means word and deed both. So when God spoke creation into being in Genesis chapter 1, that was the original word, and it was the original deed, and things came into being through that. So connecting those things, I think, and being committed to right speech, which you mentioned, the integrity of speech and action that Holy Week represents and Jesus' example. Let's talk more about this in just a moment when we come back. We want to promote a nonprofit that's dear to your heart as well.
Beautiful.
And we'll do that for just a moment, and then we'll continue.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Compassionate DFW is striving to make Dallas-Fort Worth more intentionally compassionate, where everyone is committed to live by the principles of compassion and the Golden Rule. It works through diverse initiatives: arts, business, education, environmental, healthcare, religious, spiritual, interfaith, and more. Visit CompassionateDFW.org to get involved.
Well, we're back with Amy Lewis Hofland. And Amy, we were talking before the break about this notion of fearlessness and the connection to compassion and how faith has to be both word and deed if it's going to be authentic faith. So we have, you were kind enough to bring me this book. It's called A Fearless Heart. Pronounce the name of the author for me.
Thupten Jinpa.
Thupten Jinpa. Okay, and you were mentioning that this book is actually written by the translator of and aide to the Dalai Lama.
Yes.
So you've been referring to this to me privately, and there's a passage I think you'd like to read to us.
I'd love to read it. So,
wonderful.
This book has kindled a number of discussions.
Yes.
We worked with the Center for Islamic Relations here in Dallas to create some community conversations, and we went to mosques, and we went to a synagogue, and we went to churches to talk about compassion as a unifying thread.
Okay.
And so one of my favorite paragraphs is the promise of the book. We must address our fears if we are to overcome resistance to compassion. The next part of this book will help you explore the personal beliefs underpinning yours. You will see how resistance to compassion, including self-compassion, manifests in your thoughts, attitudes, and emotional reactions, and you will learn how to deal with these through awareness and understanding. Through practice, we can learn to be with our uncertainty. I think that's so right. We just have to be comfortable with what we don't know and respond flexibly to our experiences of pain, sorrow, and fear. Not fighting them and resisting them, rather observing them, being with them, and responding with gentle understanding. This is a radically different approach to life. It asks us to change our habitual self-protective patterns. It calls for a fearless heart. Isn't that great?
A fearless heart.
A fearless heart. And it's, you set the intention, you sit with, the monsters. One of the Tibetan teachers I study talks about the beautiful monster. And you just sit in prayer. I combine prayer and meditation, and you sit with, what does it feel like to be in this space of fear? What is the worst thing that can happen to me? And I practiced it a couple of times already this year. So I made a list of the things that scare me the most.
Okay.
And Eleanor Roosevelt had that great quote of, walk into the fear that scares you the most. Walk right into it.
Yes.
And I signed up for Oral Fixation, which is a wonderful storytelling group here in town, to tell a story I haven't told in a long time. And it's the story of growing up with cleft lip and cleft palate.
Really?
And I was born with a cleft through the lip, the palate, and the nose.
Okay.
And for my faithful Episcopalian parents, it was a really tough awakening. It was a surprise. When I was born, we didn't have all these 3D sonograms.
Right.
So, it defined me for a long time. For 20 years, I had 21 operations in 21 years.
Oh, my goodness.
So I learned courage in a different way.
Yes.
I didn't know it. And this book woke that up in me. And it was to tell the story because so many Chinese adoptees that come to Dallas and come to the world,
right?
That it is a trend that they have cleft lip and cleft palate, and were given to the orphanage because they weren't perfect. I'll put that word in quotes.
Yes.
So I told my story in front of 350 people at the Wiley Theater in February. Terrifying. And it was great because my 10-year-old, I practiced it a lot before I told it. And he said, well, have you shared this with Mimi and Papa, with my mom and dad? And I said, oh, no, I'm not ready to do that. And he said, Mom, you talk about the year of courage and a fearless heart, and you can't even tell your own parents? So I called him and read it to him. And it was really a love letter to their faith and commitment that my journey to healing would be plentiful and everything I needed. So that was one. And then my second challenge is to become certified to teach yoga.
Okay.
So I'm in the 200-hour certification program at Dallas Yoga Center, which is a very hard thing to do.
I'll bet it is.
But it's really great to sit with fear of a handstand, or sit in fear of teaching a class of 30 people an hour of yoga.
See, I don't think that most people want to spend much time addressing fear because, well, okay, it seems tautological to say it scares us, right? We're afraid of fear, right? But mostly our strategy spiritually is to assume that if we can deny it, and if we actually just focus on positive things and do positive things, that we'll overcome it. But you're suggesting, I think, that a more faithful way of addressing fear is actually to address it. That is, to become aware of it, to name it.
Right.
And in doing so, it takes the fangs out of it somehow? It
does. It de-escalates the energy around it.
Okay.
And for me.
Yes.
And it really, it's sitting with fear is a different experience than perseverating over fear. And sort of imagining the worst. And you just, I'm still working on it. I'm human, and I'll work on it for the rest of my life.
Right.
But I think the sitting is the first space, the quiet, and setting the intention.
Right.
And then creating the next possibility.
Right.
For that.
Sitting with it. Now, there's there's a posture involved in that, both literally and figuratively, right? So the literal aspect of that would be a practice of sitting in quietness, and then the figurative aspect of that would be a kind of acceptance, a letting be.
Right, and that's self-compassion.
Yes.
To allow a space for 15 minutes in our day, in my crazy, wild day, which I shouldn't even say that because it's not crazy and it's not wild, right? That's all in the realm of interpretation. But George, there are so few quiet spaces left in the world. Our cars are loud. Our workspaces are louder, with our computer kind of binging every 5 minutes. I think some churches are louder.
Oh, yes.
Churches are louder and malls are louder.
Yes.
So where are the quiet spaces? There are art museums.
Right.
And then the spaces we create, the peace places that I talk about. So creating the space for prayer and meditation, learning how to sit with the breath. It's a very uncomfortable space. And I'm still working on my dad. But, to be okay with being alone with the breath. And sitting with what comes up in that moment.
Okay, yeah. Practices like these actually have some roots in Western spirituality, but you are also discovering them in Eastern spirituality too, and whether it's yoga or meditation, that sort of thing. Some Christians have a kind of worried spirit about the infiltration of Eastern practices into Western faith, that it will somehow taint or distort our own particular faith tradition. It sounds to me like you're finding more correlation, more freshness of experience that is enhancing your ability to understand your own faith. Is that true?
I completely agree. And I think the more I learn, the more resonance I see across faith traditions. It really is about love and acceptance. And love and acceptance does not deny or hold someone out of a space. So we meditate a lot at work, and I use the word meditate. And we've had some questions about that, and some ruffled feathers, and I just keep using the word meditate because I think it's okay. Before every meeting, we sit for 3 minutes. I do invite people to be present in the way that they choose. So whether they choose to sit in a space of just thought or prayer or a mantra or a meditation is totally up to them. But I do find that the more I read and see, there's a universality to being a human. And we choose our practice, and we choose our faith.
Well, contemplation is also part of the history of the Western spiritual prayer practices. This idea of meditating and contemplating, it's really the listening side, isn't it? The paying attention. But we are so given to the speaking, the talking side of prayer, to our side of this, maybe a bit more attention to meditation allows us to believe that God is actually communicating to us too, that we can actually hear back and be open and receptive, not just active.
Deep listening is a hard concept, and I've read a lot of Thich Nhat Hanh's work. I visited Plum Village last year and studied with a group of corporate people. And deep listening requires a fearless heart. Because my go-to habit is to think about, what am I going to say that makes me right? What am I going to say next that asserts my rightness in this conversation? And a deep listener isn't in that space. A deep listener has compassion to the human, to be present with the other, which is actually how I define compassion, is being present with the other. And what does it mean? How do you get to that space of presence?
It's interesting. I when I'm counseling with couples that are going to get married, I often talk to them about conflict and about relationship, and I say to them, you're going to find yourself sometimes feeling misunderstood and all of that, and you really have to decide whether you want to be right or you want to be married.
That's so right.
Because in a way, what you have to sort of give up is this need to be validated that your view of things is the important one, and instead learn this kind of compassion and respect for the other's point of view. And everything isn't about right and wrong.
Right.
Some things are really just about love. It's
Right.
about the relationship. It's not about truth, so
Right.
to speak.
Right. And really just being conscious to that everyone is suffering.
Yes.
You know, everyone is trying to figure this world out in this age of technology.
Yes.
And everyone needs a quiet space.
Okay.
I believe that. And so I hope that our collection, because it was steeped in compassion, I mean, these were objects of devotion for communities in other faith traditions than my own. I think that's part of their DNA as a collection. And then you've got a couple that built a collection out of love.
Yes.
So love is sort of part of our recipe all the way back to the
Right.
formation of the first jade that we have that's prehistoric.
Yes.
So I think that's why it works. And I hope that the crow can be the antidote to whatever's going on in people's lives.
You know, I think that there's a misconception in some Western religion about the use of objects in devotion, in spirituality. There's a fear of idolatry.
Yes.
About investing too much in them to make them gods to you, that sort of thing. But you know, the Orthodox traditions, which are more Eastern in Christianity, iconography is a very important part of their prayer life, of their devotion and worship. And what they do with that is similar to what you're describing about the objects of Eastern art, Asian art, is that you're not looking so much at them, but you're looking through them. You're looking to them in order to see what they point to.
Right.
They're a reflection in part. They're a window in part. They're not a stopping point.
Right.
They're something, a place where you can see better and understand better if you attend to it.
And we have to do that. As a museum educator, I have to find the relevance for you when you come into the Crow. And I think the context for how these objects were used or incorporated or engaged with the public at the time is really important. It teaches us how we relate to the objects that we are engaged with today, with our iPads or whatever they are.
Right.
And many of the works, especially in the Hindu tradition, are literally teaching texts, less than works of art, more scriptures through the
visual
scriptures of how we learn about compassion and wisdom.
Which is really what Western art was originally, religious art.
True, yeah.
I mean, before the Bible was available to people on a broad scale, these works of art were the only Bible that many of the common people had.
Right.
Depicting scenes from the Bible, and painters would do this, and murals in cathedrals and frescoes
stained
and
glass windows.
all these, all that sort of thing. So, well, that's a beautiful way of thinking, I think, about art. The visual aspect of it becomes sort of a text to us.
It does, and I think art plus compassion leads to healing.
Beautiful.
Whether it's community healing, racial healing, family healing. Families are starved for togetherness, understanding, and awareness, and attention. So let's have the collection create that for Dallas.
Well, that's a beautiful way for us to conclude today. Amy, thank you so much for being with us and for sharing your own faith journey and the interaction between your faith and the work that you do.
Thank you. It's been a delight. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks. That was fun.
Compassionate DFW is striving to make Dallas-Fort Worth more intentionally compassionate, where everyone is committed to live by the principles of compassion and the Golden Rule. It works through diverse initiatives: arts, business, education, environmental, healthcare, religious, spiritual, interfaith, and more. Visit CompassionateDFW.org to get involved.